It says, then, this is the king of a Moabite city. The king took his eldest son. They're about to be besieged. All of the enemy is at their gates. So what does he do? Well, he does what that tablet we just talked about, what that tablet said to do. He took his eldest son that was to reign in his place and offered him there as a burnt offering on the wall. He kills his own kid on the wall as an offering to pagan gods. And there came a great wrath against Israel, and they withdrew from him and returned to their own land. We don't know if that means the wrath of the soldiers of Moab or compelled or what happened, but Israel sees this as so repulsed that they would do that to their own children, that they basically say, stop, we'll leave. And it's exactly what you find in that ancient stone. The Bible is perfectly accurate, even down to the ceremony that they would have to beg the gods to come and defend them from the invaders. Bible's right. And you go around the world and you find Moloch had child sacrifice, and Shamash had child sacrifice, and Baal, all the gods of that region, the Moabites, the Ammonites, the Canaanites. One of the traditions that has been handed down that came into Carthage but dates back to this region is they would make a bronze statue of their god. They would light a furnace underneath it so that this whole thing would begin to glow like a soft metal glows. They would take a baby or a child and they would put it into the arms of Shamash or Moloch. And because the metal is soft, it's very pliable. And what happens when you put weight on it? It goes like this, and eventually the arms open up enough to where the baby falls down into the fire. And they would offer their children into the fire. And they would think, oh, the God is alive, he's moving. So they did that there. And we think, oh, that's barbaric. But in Rome, Rome, and notably, this is the tables of the law of Rome, a notably deformed infant shall be killed immediately. Not an option, you shall kill that child if there's any deformity. You look at some of the other cultures around. So this is first century Celtic culture from Strabo. We told of still other kinds of human sacrifices. For example, they would shoot victims to death with arrows or impale them in the temples, or having devised a colossus of straw and wood, this is where the wicker man comes from, throw into the colossus cattle and wild animals of all sorts and human beings, and then make a burnt offering of the whole thing. And so they would throw men, women, children, babies in their cattle and then burn it. And these historians are going around like, yeah, that happened. Here's Plutarch, Carthage, North Africa. With full knowledge and understanding, they themselves offered up their own children, and those who had no children would buy little ones from poor people and cut their throats as if they were so many lambs or young birds. Meanwhile, the mother stood by without tear or moan, but should she utter a single moan or let fall a single tear, she had to forfeit the money, and her child was sacrificed nonetheless. So this is all Roman Empire territories, okay? I'm going somewhere with this. When Tertullian writes against this. Tertullian's home base is Carthage, where they had that practice. And he writes to the emperor and he says, this has to stop. This is evil. And he says, you expose them. Your babies that you don't want, you just leave them out in the cold. You leave them to the animals. It was a practice called exposure. You expose them to the cold and hunger and to wild beasts, or else you get rid of them by the slower death of drowning, putting them face down in puddles. You must not overlook the fact that it's your own dear children whose life you quench. How can you do this and call yourself civilized? This is a church father to the emperor saying no. And by the way, this is right about the time, not long after this, Theodosius turns the whole empire and declares it to be a Christian empire. And guess what goes with it? All child sacrifice. The Roman law, the tables, gone. Carthage, gone. The Celtic cultures, child sacrifice, all of it banned, illegal. Because the early church and the Didache with the teaching of the 12 apostles, when they wrote, this was considered the doctrine of the apostles gathered into one document called the Didache. And it says there are two ways. He's talking about Moses. I set before you today two paths, life and death. Choose life. There are two ways, one of life and one of death, but a great difference between the two ways. You, Christian, shall not murder a child by abortion or kill that which is begotten. You look back, this is the Aztecs, 1,400 years after Jesus. And when the Europeans arrived and they look at what's going on, they assembled the children whom they slew in the first month, buying them from their mothers. They went on killing them in all the feasts which followed until the rains really began, so that until the rains began in abundance, and all the feasts, they sacrificed children. And they find mass graves of little skulls and children that were sacrificed. And you go down into South America and Peru with the pre-Incan civilization, and they killed. In one spot, they found 140 skeletons of little children that they had sacrificed. William Carey, one of the earliest evangelists and missionaries, goes over into India and finds that they're burning widows on funeral pyres. When the husband died, the widow was considered like, what's your purpose? Like, so you should die with him. So we take them and throw them on the funeral pyre and we burn them together. Him dead, her alive. And then they would take their children down to the Ganges River and they would throw their children into the Ganges River as an offering to their gods. And this is 200 years ago. And William Carey, Christian evangelist, says, I presented 3 petitions or representations to government for the purpose of having the burning of women and the other modes of murder abolished. In the case of infanticide and involuntary drowning in the river, laws were made to prevent these, which have been successful. So guess what? Christianity comes to the Americas, and what goes? Child sacrifice. Christianity comes to India, and what goes? Child sacrifice. Christianity goes around the world, in every culture that it's introduced to, guess what goes? Child sacrifice. And when Christianity leaves a culture, guess what comes back? Child sacrifice. That's right. It's stunning. But in the beginning, God is making this kind of climactic moment with Abraham saying, we are not a people that do that. We are a people that treasure life. There's going to be one offering, human offering for sin, and it's going to be me. You have life. You are a people of life. And still today, we have child sacrifice that's happening in Uganda and some other places that there's an effort to kill because they believe that if you take the body and bury it in the land, it's going to bring you prosperity. It's just, there's something in the human nature that seems to have this wherever it goes without God. That feels demonic to me. So anyway, moving right along. Any questions on that? Have I made anybody mad? Chuck? Yeah. Oh, yeah. There's definitely religions that have not done. So like when you come to, but it's scattered all through the region, right? But there are, like when you come to North America, there's probably 12 different Indian tribes, Native American tribes that had child sacrifice, but I would bet there's probably 40 or 50 that didn't. If you go to different regions, there are people that don't, but you find it peppered all over the place. It's like, why does this exist everywhere? It's a weird thing. Yeah, good question. Thanks for clarifying that. Wendy? I don't. That might not make me popular, but I don't. I think life comes at fertilization. I think God, one of my favorite verses in terms of life comes when Rebecca's pregnant. And this is like when you pray for your children, this is a good way to think of them, I think. But when God comes to Rebecca and she's pregnant with twins, Jacob, who is going to give birth to all the tribes of Israel and everything, and Esau, he says, not 2 children are in your womb, not twins are in your womb. He says 2 nations are in your womb. He doesn't say, a potential person. God not only sees the person, he sees the generations that he has planned to bring forth from that person. He sees every single Hebrew who's ever lived in the womb of Rebekah at that moment. He sees every single Edomite that will come forth from Esau in the womb at that moment. And so, it does make you wonder, okay, if he sees nations, all the generations of life that are in that one, what does that mean when you take that life? What if Rebecca had said, I choose? Does that mean a nation is wiped out? Yeah. I mean, we make light of life. We make it cheap. And I know this isn't a popular topic to talk about, but we have to become a people that see life as a gift of God. The Bible comes to us, for example, Get me on my soapbox, Wendy. You're going to get me in trouble. The Bible comes to us, and it says in 1 Corinthians, you're a temple of the Holy Spirit. That means you're not your own. You're not leasing your body to the Holy Spirit saying, you can dwell here on these conditions. Like, no, you belong to him. And then it says, your body's not your own. You were bought with a price. Therefore, glorify God in your body. So, like, what does the abortion movement say? My body, my choice. My. It's what I want. It's, and there's life of the mother and things like that. Like, the overwhelming majority of abortions are not for those extreme circumstances. Most of them are my body, my choice, my future, my desires, my. What does Jesus say? My body given up for you. The Christian ethic says, my life I'll lay down. I give. I'll sacrifice. Love by its very nature is sacrificial. Everything about abortion and what this culture is so crazy to enshrine and celebrate is the epitome of self-obsession and the refusal to love the way the Bible calls us to. It is absolutely writing off the importance of the family, the importance of marriage, the importance of parenthood, the importance of future generations, your call to lay yourself down to make the world a better place for future generations. And we've made it like what's good for me is most important. That is the ethos of abortion, and it smells a whole lot like hell. It's evil. Period. Sorry. Yeah, I mean, I'm not sorry. I know that's not why you came here tonight.
Most people forget to read the Bible after the Israelites left Egypt. They were going through all the satanic cities and exterminating them, getting rid of the pagans because they were against God. Those were Satan's people. And it looks like now we're letting it happen around us, and we're looking the other way. So
yeah, you got to be careful with that because the Lord loves redemption. Just like he's a God of life, he is a God of resurrection. And so when we declare these truths, it's not us versus them, those evil. It's our God is so powerful and the way that he breathes life into everything. There's resurrection and redemption available to everybody. That doesn't take away from the fact that abortion is what it is. And it's sad. It's a tragedy, and it's an evil tragedy. And yet our Lord, the people that I know that are post-abortive, that walk in that, some people very close to me, they love Jesus even deeper because his grace is so rich. And they believe in the resurrection. And they hope to see their children. And that's in Christ. I agree. Yeah. Yep. All right. Let me move on because we're never going to get to Moses if I keep soapboxing. All right, so ancient libraries going back in the earliest forms of writing involved pictograms. And in the 3rd millennium BC, cultures in Mesopotamia, where Abraham came from, began using these wedge-shaped writings that's cuneiform, and you see this all over the place. And so now we know how to translate these things. And some of them talk about the conditions that would have been around for Abraham. So, for example, Abram impregnated his servant in order to bear a child. Well, that sounds weird to modern culture, right? But you go to any of the ancient law codes, one of the oldest, Ur-Nammu law code, said that even though this was a sinful thing, if you went to the Ur-Nammu law code, it said, of course, if your wife is unable to have children, then take a concubine or a maidservant and have children through her. That's not the Bible. The Bible's very much against polygamy. It's very much against taking anything other than one wife. But this was the culture. Where did Abraham come from, by the way? What's their culture? Oh, my wife can't have children? I go to a concubine. He's living out where he grew up, which fits the scriptures. The Code of Hammurabi, which is one of the most ancient legal codes that came out of Babylon, says if a man takes a wife and she gives this man a maidservant as a childbearer, and the maidservant does bear him children, then this maid assumes equality with the wife because she's borne him children. Can you imagine now why Sarah is so jealous? What does it mean when Hagar has a child? She's no longer she's now competing with me for my husband. She's equal because that's the culture of the day. The Nuzi tablets were just discovered, and this is in Nuzi, which is in Iraq. 7,000 clay tablets with fragments and insights into societal norms and culturally popular names. What do you find on them? Now, if the Bible was written in the post-exile, right, so 550 BC, and they're guessing what names were 1,500 years earlier, they got really lucky because in those tablets you find names like Abraham, Israel, Esau, Salim. And so all these names like Jerusalem, Shalem, you find those. The Nuzi tablet showed that fathers adopted daughters to train up as wives for their sons. So a really popular theory that I think is interesting is, you know how Abraham keeps going around and telling Sarah, tell him you're my sister. You know what? And in the Bible it says, and she, where is that? Besides, she really is my sister. So it's like, okay, is that incest? And that's quite possibly the case, that he's sleeping with his real sister that's a half-sister, the daughter of my father but not of my mother. But there was an ancient practice. Remember, everything in the ancient world is an arranged marriage. And so what happened is you'd have these different cultures that are looking for daughters or wives for their sons, but then they get them when they're 20 or 15 years old or something, and now they're getting married and they're bringing with them all their in-laws' culture. And so what became popular during this time is adoption. I'm going to adopt a girl that's of the right age from a neighboring village. I'm going to raise them up in my household, and when my son is of marrying age and she is of marrying age, I'm going to give my adopted daughter that really is of the father's house to the son. And there's a lot of people that think that might actually be what's going on there, which is an interesting way to view it. The Ebla tablets. So this guy from the University of Rome excavated the ruins of this place, found 11,000 clay tablets, and the library affirmed biblical details. For example, skeptics claim that Canaan was a made-up thing. It didn't exist at the time of Abraham, but the tablets that date back to 2300 BC are filled with references to Canaan. And so it's like every discovery, it's like, oh, yeah, I guess the Bible was right. Oh, yeah, I guess the Bible was right. Oh, I guess those names really were there. The Hittites are mentioned 58 times in the Old Testament. Again, skeptics used to argue the Hittites are fictional. They don't even exist. There's no record of them anywhere but the Bible, so that was just made up. So in 1906, Hugo Winkler discovers the Hittite capital of Hattusa, complete with ruins, 10,000 clay tablets that talk about the history of the Hittites. This is Hattusa with their old ancient gates that are uncovered. Oh, yeah, I guess the Bible was right. Lucky guess of those post-exile Hebrews who just made all this up, though. Really lucky guess. So Genesis 23 says Abraham rose and bowed to the Hittites. Do they exist? Yes, they exist. The cave of the patriarchs. Here's another one, the tomb of the patriarchs. There's a mosque that a tomb that Herod built over the top of where the traditional site is, where the patriarchs are believed to be buried to this day. It's in Hebron, which is not a safe place to visit, so I've never been there, sadly. I would love to go there. But if you look underneath, way back, they let people go down and take pictures of the caves that lead down into here, and here's the diagram of where they have the two caves that they believe that they're buried and built on top of. But they found exactly what you would expect, which is the 6 burials. You have Abraham and Sarah and Isaac and Rebekah and Jacob and his... not Rachel, but Leah. She gets redeemed in the end. He chooses to be buried with her after all that marital strife. In the end, he picks her. It's kind of a cool redemption story, if you know that story. Here's one. Here's a weird one. Remember when Esau comes in and he's famished and he's like, oh, I need a son. And Jacob's like, I'll sell you the birthright for a taste of stew. And you're like, that makes no sense to us today. I got no birthright to sell. But the Nuzi tablets contain ancient legal codes for inheritance rights, and fathers were forbidden to transfer birthrights away from their firstborn sons. So Isaac can't do that. But the tablets did make allowances for the firstborn sons, Esau, to sell their birthright, which he does for a taste of stew, which is like Esau saying, all the promises of God, everything that's established for that firstborn, I'll give it away for a taste of stew. A taste. I'll trade God for just a a taste of it. In Genesis, Esau despised his birthright, sold it to Jacob for a swallow of lentil stew. Here's one that's interesting. How many of you know the story? These are all obscure. That's why I'm rushing through them. There's a story where Rachel and Leah and Jacob are leaving Laban's house. And when they're leaving, Laban's upset with them because he believes that, they've ripped him off, and Jacob is trying to sneak out, and they escape away, and then Laban and his men chase him down, and he comes to him and he's like, somebody's taken all of my household gods. Where are the household gods? Where are they? Who knows? They're under her. They're under her saddle. And so Laban comes and he's like, do you have them? No. Do you have them? No. Do you have them? No. They come to Rachel and they say, do you have the household gods? And what does Rachel say? I'm menstruating. You don't want to look under here. The Bible's kind of gross at times. It's cool. Anyway, what's that all about? Why is he freaking out about the household gods? You read that chapter of the Bible, you know what they're obsessed about all before they leave? Who's getting the inheritance? Who's getting the inheritance? All of Laban's kids are like, they're trying to steal our inheritance. And they're over here going, they're taking our inheritance and we're getting, Laban has screwed us out of what we deserve and everything. Well, we know why he was freaking out. We just found this in the last 50 years. In Genesis 31, Jacob and Laban are involved in a dispute over possessions. Leah and Rachel are complaining about inheritance rights when Rachel stole her father's household gods. Why? Newsy Tablet 51. Here's your reason. Provides the answer. It declares that the primary heir of a father's estate must have possession of the household gods. So you could not take the inheritance unless you possess the gods. What are they arguing about? The inheritance. Who gets the inheritance? Whoever has the household gods. Now, how in the world did the post-exile people know that? I mean, the Newsy Tablets have been covered for centuries and centuries and centuries and centuries by the time the post-exile happens. And so the author of these stories is very intimately aware of all the cultural traditions and laws, even down to something like that. The Mari Tablets. 1925, archaeologists discovered the Mari Tablets near the eastern border of Iraq. These tablets affirmed that several Old Testament names were common. You find names like Benjamin, Nahor, Haran, Hazor, Laish. The tablets also speak of the Amorites, an ancient civilization that resided in the land of Canaan that skeptics said didn't exist, and then that gets overblown. Another thing, when it says that Abraham had camels, he's rewarded by Pharaoh with camels. All the skeptics were like, they didn't domesticate camels until 900 BC, another clear evidence of the Bible lying, until they find petroglyphs and caves in Egypt that show a man leading a camel. Or ancient pottery that dates to the 3rd millennium BC that is what? Camels with all kinds of baggage, belts around them and everything. So guess what? Camels were domesticated. They were used as animals. Another bad news for the skeptics. We're told in Genesis 33 that Jacob purchased a parcel of a field near Shechem many centuries later. This is where Jesus meets the Samaritan woman, offers her living water, and she says, are you greater than that of our father Jacob, who gave us the well and drank from it? You can still go there to this day and actually go into the church, also kind of a sketchy neighborhood in Nablus. Like, we were entering into this place. Israel is safe, but was anyone on that trip with us when we're entering into it and it's like gunfire? We're looking at the side of the church and there's bullet holes in the church and we're like, are we safe? And they're like, oh yes, this is celebratory gunfire. It's like, okay. Go to Israel though, it's worth it. Anyway. But you can go, and I have had drinks from this well. Yeah.
Were those household idols small enough that they would
Yes.
him or so?
One of the things that's crazy is anytime you come across an image, let me find one, like this thing. When you look at that, how big would you estimate that to be? Yeah, some people, I'm looking, are doing this. Some people are like iPhones. That thing's like a rice Chex. It is tiny. So everything that you come across in the ancient world, when you see a picture of it, unless someone's standing next to it, where am I? Oh, so the teraphim, which is the household gods, these guys, they are tiny, like tiny. So it's not like, she's not on the donkey, it's on a pile of, so, yeah. I'm not sure, probably. All All right, so is there any evidence to support the biblical story of Joseph? So you walk through the patriarchs, you get Abraham and his wife Sarah, who gives birth to Ishmael, who's not the chosen one. Isaac is. Isaac gives birth to Jacob and Esau. But these people don't. Ishmael, Esau hate God. Jacob is a scoundrel, but he'll do anything for the promise of God. And he has 12 kids. One of them is Joseph, who's the one who's going to be betrayed, sold down into Egypt. And this is the guy that we're looking for. Here's a quote from a skeptic from Tel Aviv University. These quotes are like 25 years old, so I don't know if he would still say yes to this. But then he said the Israelites never were in Egypt. The whole chain is not a historical one. It is a later legendary reconstruction of a history that never happened. It's fun to see how they eat all these words later. So one of the claims that's made against the story of Joseph, and this is kind of a cheap one, is everybody says there's no way that a slave would have been sold for 20 shekels, which is what Joseph is going to be sold for, taken down to Egypt by the Ishmaelite traders. And so then they started discovering all these ancient tablets and legal codes, and oh, guess what? In the Akkadian Empire and Ur-3 periods, a slave was bought for 10 to 15 shekels. So even cheaper, right? In the old Babylonian code of Hammurabi, the price for a slave is what? 20 shekels. Guess how much Joseph sold for? 20 shekels, exactly that amount. And so what is Egypt? Hint, hint. It's everything death. Like when you think of ancient Egypt, it's slavery, it's the serpent, which this is a burial mask, so death. Their Bible is the Book of the Dead, mummies, pyramids, desert. There's no life. Unless you're like at the Nile, there's no life. And so Egypt was obsessed with death and resurrection. So when Joseph is sold for 20 pieces of silver down to Egypt, what do you hear in that? Put it together. Who else was sold for silver down to death, right? So we're going to get into this later, but think of how God is preaching the gospel right here, like out of the gates. So this is, I wonder how this is going to do. This is downtown Fort Lauderdale, pixelated image, just so you understand how seriously they took death. The Great Pyramid, which when you see it in person, like no picture I've ever seen does it justice, but that would be, the Great Pyramid is exactly as tall as the tallest building of Fort Lauderdale. Massive, massive. And it's built 4,500 years ago. Before Abraham was born, it was already in existence. These things are massive, they're impressive, and I want to show you, because this is probably the best picture I have that can show context, or size-wise. Oh, it doesn't go down far enough. Oh, yeah. You see? Can you see that?
There you are.
Those are people. Yeah, okay, yeah, here's better. So those are people. The things are, it was the tallest building in the world until the Eiffel Tower. It held for millennia, the record. So anyway, which one? This one? So here's a cool little, so Saladin, when they came, they were like, oh, these pyramids. He's a Muslim warrior, Saladin, famous guy. He's like, these pyramids are an offense to Allah. So he tries to take them down. He goes to the smallest little baby pyramid, and he starts ordering his soldiers to tear it down. They spent 8 months removing stones, and they only made that little divot. Saladin was like, praise Allah, these pyramids are wonderful. So here's the dating, that if we're going to try to figure out the dates, here are our clues. In 1 Kings 6:1, it says it was 480 years after the Exodus that Solomon began building the temple. Well, that's helpful because we know that Solomon's reign began in 970, and 4 years into it, 966 BC, remember BC goes the wrong way. In 966 BC, he begins building the temple. Go back 480 years, that means Moses delivered them out of Egypt in 1446 at the age of 80. Now, we know that they're there for 430 years total from the time Joseph comes in, which means anything that we're looking for Joseph, if the timeline's accurate and all that matches up, we should be looking around 1876 BC for Joseph, which fits the rest of all of our stuff with Abraham and everything else. And so the timeline looks something like this. And here is where we should find Joseph, who is sold by his brothers, taken from the land of Canaan down into Egypt, settles in this region of Goshen, which is the northeast of the Nile Delta. And it says, "You shall live in the region of Goshen and be near me." This is at the end of the story when he's like, hey, all my brothers are here, the forgiveness has happened, all that. He says, "You shall live in the region of Goshen and be near me, you and your children and your grandchildren and flocks and herds and all that you have." So here's Goshen, northeastern portion of the Nile Delta. We also have another clue that we find at the end, and it says, "Then Joseph settled his father and his brothers in the land of Egypt and gave them property in the best part of the land of Goshen, and he calls it the land of Ramses, as Pharaoh had commanded." Well, the good news is we know where Ramses is. The bad news is that Ramses doesn't get the name Ramses until the 19th dynasty of Egypt, which when you're looking at this thing, the 19th dynasty is going to be about here. And remember, Joseph is here, so how can you live in Ramses if Ramses isn't yet a city? Am I making sense? You with me? And so if that's where Joseph's family comes to Ramses, but this is the reign of Ramses, how is it named Ramses? And the answer is, it wasn't. So this is one of those things that when the Bible translators are helping you out, like if I said into this room, has anyone ever been to New Amsterdam? Do you know what New Amsterdam is? It's New York. It's the old name of New York. So you could say, yeah, but everybody in here is going, what does that mean? I don't know what that is. So it's like New York, right? So Ramses. But when they go to Ramses, it's cool because when you dig down in the archaeological record underneath Ramses, they weren't living there. We're not looking at a people who lived there in the 19th dynasty. When you keep digging down, because remember in archaeology, the oldest stuff's at the bottom and you keep building on top of it, right? Underneath it is a city called Avaris. And when they start getting into that layer, it's like tons of stuff, just really cool stuff starts coming. And this is the guy, he's not a believer, but his name's Manfred Bitak. He is an archaeologist from the University of Vienna who's in charge of all the digging at this region of Goshen. And so one of the things that he found that he wrote about is there's all these palaces that are there that are not Egyptian style. They're way out of the ordinary for what you find in Egyptian. They're Syro-Palestine. They're like the stuff that would be from Israel and in the land of Canaan. And so he had his team mock up, this is what the ruins suggest this house would have looked like. And you find roof courtyards and stuff like that and the way that the windows are structured. And the other thing is he finds this obsession with 12, where there's 12 windows on each side. And in the courtyard, there's remnants of 12 pillars. Can you think of a people that's obsessed with 12? Or would have a reason to be obsessed with 12? Maybe the 12 tribes, the 12 sons of Jacob, who are all supposed to live together in the city of Ramses. Well, one of the cool things is when you go out into the yard, you can see them here in the background, there's these tombs. Take a guess how many? 12, right? So, thank you. It was actually good. So one, if we count them up, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Did I do that right? 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Where's the 12th? The pyramid. Why would one be a pyramid? Who got a pyramid for a burial? A royal official. What was Joseph? A royal official. So there's 12 burial plots for families. One of them gets a pyramid, a mansion that's in Syro-Palestine, not Egyptian style. That's interesting. In the very place where the Bible tells us that Joseph and his brothers settled. And so when you get there, it says, Joseph made the sons of Israel swear an oath and said, God will surely come to your aid. Then you must carry up my bones from this place. When you go to ancient pyramids, you can go to the Cairo Museum, and they actually have a room in the Cairo Museum where you walk in and you see all these pharaohs and their wives and mummies and little children mummies that are still there. Like you can look at Amenhotep II. You can look at Thutmose III. They're right there in a glass case, weird looking. They always leave behind the bones. They'll take the gold. Like grave robbers always take the gold from the pyramids. They don't take the bones, right? So you always find the bones. Guess what you don't find in here? You don't find bones. Why not? Joseph made them promise. When you leave here, you'd better take up my bones. And when you get to the Exodus story, guess what it tells you? They gathered up the bones of Joseph and they left. And here you find a pyramid, 12 obsessions, Syro-Palestine, architecture, everything else. And so one of the things from this dynasty, this is 12th dynasty, during the reign of Senwosret, 60 years prior to Joseph, you know what they're obsessed with? This is the hieroglyphs on his tomb wall. It says, "No one was unhappy in my days, not even in the years of famine, for I had tilled all the fields of the nome of Ma." Nome was like a regional governor. "Up until its southern and northern frontiers. Thus I prolonged the life of its inhabitants and preserved the food for which it produced." So how was a governor measured? By preventing famine. What's the story of Joseph in that role? As the lead number 2 to Pharaoh. It's all about famines. And so when you go inside the tomb, they find the remnants. This is obviously a computer rendering. They find this is the statue that's inside the pyramid. What do you notice about it? It's a man with red hair, right? So what do we know that's in Joseph's family? What does his uncle Esau look like? He's all hairy, and what color is his hair? It's red. So red runs in the family, which is so hard for our brains to accept, right? We want everyone's black-haired. But all of a sudden, you see Joseph, and he's got red hair, which is the way that Egyptians oftentimes portrayed Semitics in their artwork. What else do you notice? He's got a coat that's super colorful. He's got this mushroom-shaped haircut, which they always also put on them, and you can tell that it's the dye and pigment that's on it is still red. You look at a close-up, and you can still see the pigment stains. This was a redheaded dude with a hair shape, that came from the area of Israel. And it's hard to see when you first look at this, but let me go back and forth, and you'll train your eyes. See it? So this was a multicolored robe that he's in. What's Joseph famous for? Multicolored robe. Which, by the way, in the ancient world, that wasn't like only Joseph and the whole world had a multicolored robe. The reason for that was there was a tradition that lasted centuries that when you conquered your enemies, you would take part of their robe and stitch it into your own. And so if you had a whole bunch of conquered enemies, it meant you were really powerful, but what would your robe look like? You had all kinds of colors on there because you'd conquered all kinds of people. And so if you wanted to make somebody look really important, you put them in a multicolored robe. And his dad says, hint, hint, lots of people are going to bow down to you. And then when Joseph starts dreaming that, the dad's like, hold on, don't tell anyone. But that's the message of Joseph. He is supposed to be set apart and a leader. This is for scale. It's no small little pyramid in the backyard. It was a pretty big deal. Joseph's statue was more than twice life size. And the hieroglyph, the throwing stick in Egyptian hieroglyphs means foreigner. And so the name there has foreigner in it for Israel. So this is all the places. This is another little factoid from history that's how else do you explain this? In the 12th dynasty, you didn't have a big powerful pharaoh. You had a pharaoh, but he was almost like the chief among equals among all the nomes that are scattered. You had different governors, 12 of them, that were scattered throughout Egypt. And they were all pretty well equally powerful. What happened in the life of Joseph? A big famine. Everybody from all over the world is coming to Goshen to buy grain from Joseph. And what does Joseph say year one? Give me all your money. Right? And what does he do with that money? Gives it all to Pharaoh. And the next year they come back, and what happens? They don't have any more money. What do they have to do? Give me all your cattle. Give me your livestock. Then they come back the next year, and he just keeps giving me your lives eventually. And the Bible says, this is one of the things that we read right past, it's a warning against big government, quite frankly, on my libertarian soapbox. But when this happens, Joseph takes all of the power, all the possession, all the industry, because that's what the livestock was, all the money, and he says, Pharaoh, here, you take care of the people. And what does Pharaoh do with it? He says, I've got all the power, I'll enslave my people. And so he shows preferential treatment to Joseph and his brothers in the land of Goshen, gives them the finest of linens, gives them the best housing, lets him watch all his livestock, and he reduces all the people of Egypt to servitude. What's the problem with that? Warning of two-party political system, by the way. Next soapbox. What happens is there's a Pharaoh that emerges that does not know Joseph. And then what does he think? Why are my people enslaved? They should be enslaved. And that's exactly what happens. What was the solution? Don't give all that power to Pharaoh. Because what happens in the 12th dynasty, you go from having very equal nomes, equal in power, to all of a sudden, and everybody knows this because Joseph buys everything and reduces the people of Egypt, all of a sudden Pharaoh becomes super powerful, mega powerful. And who is the Pharaoh during the reign of Joseph? Well, if we're looking at our timeline, it's this guy, whose name is Amenemhat III. Whenever a Pharaoh would go through an intense period of famine or worldwide trial, they would be portrayed looking very somber. So this Pharaoh had something pretty traumatic happening in the world for him. He reigns right at the period. His name is, he's nicknamed the Troubled Pharaoh. And so this is from Manfred Bitak's report, okay? So this is the non-believer archaeologist from Vienna who says, we have evidence of specialized Asiatic just means they're from Asia, meaning Israel, Palestine area. We have evidence of specialized Asiatic settlements around the Middle Kingdom royal residence, especially from the reign of Amenemhat III. There we go, right time period. We found fragments of a colossal statue of limestone depicting an Asiatic dignitary with a mushroom-shaped coifer holding a throw stick at his right shoulder, which means foreigner. He says it was a seated statue nearly twice life size, of excellent quality. The hair was painted red while the color of the skin was yellow, which also suggests from that region the traditional color of Asiatics in Egyptian art. The form of the statue has no parallels in Egypt. This isn't a common thing. So like when we say this is really unique, there's not another one. You don't find another royal figure and a thing like this that has all the markings of somebody who's a Canaanite, Hebrew, whatever, Semitic person that's given these honors in Egypt. There's nothing like this. It says our statue was smashed intentionally, suggesting that there was political turmoil in the region. Can you think of why the Egyptians might have hated him and wanted him smashed? Well, yeah. I mean, their whole people were enslaved. And so the direct proximity of the tombs to the palace is certainly an Asiatic tradition. So Egyptians put their dead way away. They put them on the west side of the east side of the Nile. West side of the Nile, which is where they buried the dead. You definitely didn't bury them in your backyard. So the fact that this guy has tombs in his backyard, like, who is this? Like, this is certainly not Egyptian. The burial of donkeys in front of the tombs, like that would have been considered unclean to the Egyptians, is from the Middle Bronze Age culture of Palestine. They pull weaponry and different things that are buried. They're all from Syro-Palestine, which means this family came from the land of Israel. Then, this is like another cool thing, like just on the nose. This is the archaeologist writing. He says, we found an amethyst scarab mounted on a gold ring inscribed with the title and name of the owner, which was damaged by tomb robbers. So this is the gold ring. You can see where this part is smashed off. Most probably, the owner was the overseer of foreign countries who had responsibility for the organization of trading expeditions. What's Joseph's job? Trade. Foreign trade. They come, they buy grain. I sell to these foreigners, people coming from all over the world. And by the way, when Joseph is exalted to the right hand of Pharaoh, what does it make a big deal to tell you? Pharaoh said to Joseph, I hereby put you in charge of the whole land of Egypt. Pharaoh took his signet ring from his finger, put it on Joseph's finger, and all the countries came to Egypt to buy grain from Joseph. So we even have the gold ring, okay? So that's one little yard. You see Syro-Palestine, the obsession with 12, the haircut, the yellow skin, all of that suggesting Israel, the right numbers, all the right burial. And by the way, you know how the ancients, if they came from Semitic, Israeli culture, Hebrew culture, do you know how they were buried? This is kind of cool. How are Egyptians buried? They're on their back, and if they're of nobility, they get to cross their arms over their chest. So if you ever see a pharaoh buried, it's this. How are the Hebrews buried? Fetal position. Why? What happens to somebody in a fetal position? They're going to be born again. So they viewed the grave as, I'm going to be birthed out of this. It's a sleeping position. I'm going to wake up. So these people had a hope in the resurrection, which is really kind of cool. We don't know that. We don't have their writings, but you look at them in the grave and you're like, oh, wake up. Like they're expecting to wake up. So what else do we know from the period? You look at this exact period, and what should we find? The Bible says that all of the world was coming to Joseph to buy grain. Well, just so happens, in their book, The Political Situation in Egypt During the Second Intermediate Period, there's a back order for this one. Two University of Copenhagen Egyptologists wrote that a massive migration took place from Syro-Palestine tribes into the Egyptian delta that took place in the 19th century. When should you find Joseph? The 19th century BC, 1870-ish, right? Exactly then, huge migration that comes into Egypt precisely at the time of Joseph. We have ancient artwork. This is dated to 1900 BC, dating of these things, give or take a century, right? 1900 BC, the sage Nefertiti, not Nefertiti, Nefertiti lamented that the infiltration of the Semitic people, all these people coming from Joseph's homeland, coming in, he says, all happiness has gone away. The land is cast down in trouble because of those feeders. The Asiatics, remember where the Asiatics come from? Canaan, the land where Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and the sons were. Asiatics who are throughout the land. Enemies have arisen in the east. Asiatics have come down to Egypt. So it's not just all of the circumstances of Joseph's property and all the burials and everything else, but now we see the migration and they're coming down. And oh, by the way, what are they called? Why would they be called feeders? They're migrating for the weather and property. No, they're hungry. They need food. So they're called feeders. Hint, hint. All of this is just so perfectly coming aligned. And it's right around this period that the Bar Yosef comes about. Now, this is if you're in a satellite looking down in Egypt, here you have the Nile Delta. Sorry for this, I need to find a better picture. But you see the Nile, wherever the Nile goes, there's life. And prior to the reign of Amenemhat III, this did not exist. But all of a sudden, right during this period, somebody has this brilliant idea that, hey, this land over here is a little bit lower than where the Nile flows. If we dig a canal down there, we'll be able to irrigate that and expand our farmland, and that will protect us from famine. What does it say that Joseph did during the years of abundance? He surveyed all the land of Egypt. Well, gee, I wonder what he found. And so then there's a canal that's dug from here to there. You see that little trench thing that connects the two? Bar Yosef, which is what it is called to this day, means the canal of Joseph. Bar Yosef. Bar Yosef. And so that happens during the reign of Amenemhat III. And you talk about driving around in Egypt. I took these pictures with my phone. This is normal Egypt. It's beautiful, kids. Take it all in, right? More dirt. When you get down to the Fayum, which is what the Bar Yosef takes you to, it just explodes with life. It like increased their amount of crops. Still to this day, an immense amount. This is before I became headmaster, you'll notice. But anyway, this is that trench that's dug that leads over into the Fayum. And I'm standing a hop, skip, and a jump away from a pyramid. And I'll tell you why that's important. So at that time, you have another guy who serves as a vizier. A vizier is like a governor figure. It's a high-ranking official. You don't need to know this, but it's kind of cool. And the Lahun Papyrus, this guy Keti serves as a vizier of Amenemhat III, and it says he harvested in the Fayum oasis. Now, the word Keti means farming in Sanskrit, cultivation in Hindu, but the papyrus notices something's off in Egypt. Something he doesn't like about the way Egypt is being governed. Listen to what he says. The papyrus states that Pharaoh, the powers of Egypt, have impoverished his associates, his countrymen, his people, for the benefit of others. When did that happen in history? Well, gee, this guy dates to exactly the right time, And he's talking about the Pharaoh impoverishing his own people, maybe like reducing them to servitude, while giving others the best part of the land, and others the best of the linens, and others the best of the food and cattle and everything else. And so this is the pyramid of Amenemhat III, and it's built right next to the Bar Yusef. So that Pharaoh that reigned during the troubled times, that overcame the famine and everything else, decides that the Bar Yusef is so precious to him that he abandons his other pyramid. He'd begun constructing the Black Pyramid way to the north. Only 5 pyramids are built down south with this one. You just didn't do it. Everybody built their pyramids up north. And so he builds his pyramid. He says, oh, the Black Pyramid, scrap it. This canal saved my legacy. I want my pyramid built right next to the Bar Yusef. And so Amenemhat III is going to be buried there. I think, what did I say? It ranks as the second southernmost pyramid ever built. Way unusual. And he abandons his other pyramid to be there. So this Yusef guy was really a big deal to Amenemhat III, right? All this. And by the way, here I am going into the entrance of Amenemhat III's. It looks more noble than it is because it's filled with trash and water. So I didn't go any further than that. But it wasn't making it to the pyramid of the Pharaoh. All right, any questions on that? Yes. So what happens if you go back up until when you get to like the 18th dynasty, which is probably the more famous period of Egypt? That's when Moses leads the Exodus. In the 19th dynasty, you see Ramses II. In the 18th dynasty, you see big names like Amenhotep and Thutmose and those guys. During that period, they weren't building pyramids anymore. So like if you look at a burial place, it's like more flat. They're tombs. When you see a pyramid, chances are it's way older. So this is 12th dynasty. I would guess, I don't know the answer to that, but if I had to venture a guess, somebody could probably Google it, but I'd say 50, maybe. Yeah.
So you mentioned skeptics.
Yeah.
Many times, and I believe I understand what a skeptic would be, but could you just talk about, like, what is it, just non-religious, academic elite? Are they,
So here's a sad thing that happens in academia. The question is, what makes a skeptic? Like how would you describe them? In academia, everybody is terrified to say this could be Joseph. Because the moment they do, the entire academic community looks at them like kook. So there's 2 schools. One is called a minimalist and one's called a maximalist. The minimalist looks at it and says, I'm only going to give the evidence and I'm going to downplay any associations. I'm not going to use the Bible. I'm going to say, and the maximalist says, I'm going to use the Bible. Like if the Bible says this happened there, I want to go dig there and I want to use this. And the maximalist was the driving favorite up until about 1960. In 1960, all of that shifted. And now if you come in and you show any bias, like I'm a Christian, I believe this stuff really happened, what they would say is your confirmation bias leads you to conclusions that it shouldn't lead you to. And so all of the people by nature want to be considered a minimalist because it's like, I don't have a dog in the fight. I'm just here. Give me my grant and I'll shut up and go over here and just tell you what I find. But there's some of them, there's some archaeologists now that go overboard to deny it still. Like when there's evidence screaming in their face, like there's a guy named Israel Finkelstein. There's a real name. And there's so much evidence now that's out there about King David and the size of his empire. Like we'll get to it, hopefully, maybe, eventually. But there's so much. Like, how do you deny it? I mean, we have his palace. We have tablets slung all over Israel to the extremes of Beersheba, way up to Dan and Haswaret. Like all over the place, we have these things that affirm the size of his kingdom. And we have records and other people that mention Israel and the size of it. And he'll still say, tribal chieftain, limited, regional. And it's like, What? Like, how do you ignore all that? And so the skeptic is like entrenched. Like, if somebody says I'm a minimalist, but they're open to the evidence being like, and they're usually what they'll, you know, maybe, but they'll never land somewhere. A skeptic is like when evidence is like screaming in their face and they say, couldn't be. No way. That's made up. They were never there.
Is that all the disciplines do?
Yeah.
Anthropology and archaeology?
All right, so this gets into a little bit of a political thing. I don't want to jump into more like geopolitical. So the UN is horrible. I'm just going to say that. The United Nations is. I'm making all kinds of friends today. But the United Nations has something that's called the UNESCO, and UNESCO runs all of the archaeological digs. They oversee everything. There is such a political hot potato on every dig that happens in that region. And here, the reason why is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Because if you go back before 1948, when Israel was established as a nation by the United Nations and they allowed them to resettle their homeland, prior to that, all the Palestinian scholars were like, of course the Jews were here. Of course Solomon had a temple. Of course we acknowledge all of the history. But then once they got there, now it's a turf war, and it's like, hey, you're colonizing our homeland. And they're like, what are you talking about? This is our ancestral homeland. We've been here forever. And so what happened is you had the Palestinians like Yasser Arafat that said the Jews never lived here. There's no history of them here. Solomon's temple, never here. The second temple, never here. All of their history, made up. The Jews never here. Jesus, like, never was. And so what happens is the UN comes along, and if you pay attention to geopolitical politics, they always side against Israel. For whatever reason, they just do. And you have the UN that comes along and will not allow digs and won't allow appointments of chief archaeologists there unless they're grandfathered in and they're of the old school, but they've earned their reputation, and so they're allowed to be there until they die. But all the new ones, like in Jericho, when you have a guy who's like, I believe that this fits all the criteria of the destruction of Jericho, guess what happens to him? He gets replaced with somebody who covers up the evidence. This really happened. That covers up that section of the evidence, digs somewhere else and says, oh yeah, that we don't believe, that's not the right timeline. And it's like, come on. So there's real... It's a biased field, sadly. It's like it's academia and the university system. It's a rigged deck. Yeah.
Have they ever figured out how they built the pyramids?
Well, there's all kinds of theories. The last one I saw that was kind of cool, and we'll move on because I really don't know. Aliens is a popular one, like because the technology is so amazing, and it's like, you know, this much true north, and the average stone is 2.5 tons, and it's as taller than, you know, as tall almost as the Eiffel Tower. How in the world are they moving these things? The last one I saw was the article you sent me, where they took water supplies and they did this super elaborate system of locks and dams, and they would use water and float the rocks up for a long distance. But it's like every other idea, the scholars are like, it can't be that. Like, they didn't have the resource. We don't know how that happened. So there's all kinds of theories, but the bottom, we don't know. So 118. Wow. Yeah. So there you go. Yeah.
Are you familiar with the professor? I think his name is Bart Ehrman in North Carolina, who was a believer and now has made a
Yeah.
career out of being a...
Textual criticism. I have a whole episode on Under the Hood dedicated to Bart Ehrman. What's that? You got to find it. It's on textual criticism. Yeah. In the last time we went through this series, we did something on textual criticism.
But he made a career. I mean, he went from a believer to making a financial career out of being
100%. So here's the funny thing. Bart Ehrman, oh, what's his name? One of the foremost Christians no, not Daniel Wallace, but yeah, that would have been the other guy. Bruce Metzger, not Guy Metzger. So Bruce Metzger was a guy who was like foremost biblical scholar, studied all the ancient manuscripts, brilliant. He and Bart Ehrman were connected at the hip, you know, writing evangelical works about how the Bible could be trusted. Guess how many books they sold when they wrote books? I mean, like, not a lot. Nobody's like, textual criticism? Like, nobody buys that. The moment that he left and started writing books like Misquoting Jesus and doubting the reliability of Scripture, he becomes a New York Times bestseller. And in the books, if you read Misquoting Jesus, he spends the whole book saying you can't trust the Scriptures. And then at the end, when the editors in the appendix ask him, is there anything in your evidence of textual criticism that challenges the essential doctrines of the Christian faith? He says, no, you can trust it. It's like, why'd you write the book? Like, but anyway, he used to be like, you can totally trust the Bible. You can totally trust the Bible. We have all this evidence. Shifted, and he says that, and that he's honest where he admits that he left the evangelical faith not because of the evidence, but because he struggled with the problem of evil. How could God allow evil in the world? So I appreciate that, but it wasn't intellectual reasons why he left, which is interesting considering that he makes his living making the intellectual arguments. Any other good questions, good discussions? I want to be on the hot seat. So this is some of my favorite things about how God weaves these stories together. So you see all this evidence of Joseph. You see the tombs and all the stories. But if you take a step back and you read the story of Joseph, let's just read it together. Tell me what you see here. Joseph is a shepherd. Can you think of anyone else that's referred to as a shepherd? Joseph is one of the 12 sons of Jacob, so it's a grouping of 12. Joseph is the beloved son of his father. He's clothed in a multicolored robe. He testified against his brother's sins, which is the whole reason why he got sold. He dreamed that all knees would bow to him. His brothers plotted to kill him. He was betrayed for silver coins. He was stripped of his robe. His tunic was dipped in blood. He was bound and led away to Egypt. What do you hear in that? I am the good shepherd. He draws the 12 apostles, beloved son of his father. He is clothed in the majesty of his father. By the way, he comes to testify of the darkness. Every knee and every knee will bow and every tongue confess, right? Philippians. His brothers plot to kill him. They betray him for 30 pieces of silver. He's stripped of his robe. His robe is dipped in blood. You know, in Revelation, when it describes Jesus coming back, it says that his robe is dipped in blood. Why does it tell you that? He's a greater Joseph. He's a greater Joseph. He was bound, led away to the grave. Doesn't stop there. Like Joseph, he's falsely accused. Like Joseph, remember, he's imprisoned with the cupbearer and the baker between two criminals. Sound familiar? Between two thieves on the cross. One of those criminals will be restored. One of those criminals will be condemned. What does that sound like? Thieves on the cross. One mocks him, never turns. The other one says, what? Leave him alone. He doesn't deserve this. He's righteous. We deserve to be where we are. And then he looks at Jesus and says, Lord, remember us when you come into your kingdom. You know what that expresses? If somebody's about to die on a cross and you say, hey, when you're anointed king, you don't say that. That's nonsensical, right? If I'm like on my deathbed and the thing's going beep, 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 you don't run up to me and go, hey, when you get elected president, like that wouldn't make sense. So what did this thief on the cross believe? You're going to conquer death. You will be king. That's crazy faith. And what does Jesus say to him? You will be with me in paradise. One thief restored. One thief remains condemned. Joseph forgave his persecutors. Father, forgive them. They know not what they do. He's raised up to the right hand of Pharaoh. Where's Jesus? Raised up to the right hand of God the Father. He's clothed in the royal robes. And by the way, he gives his brothers the royal clothing and covers them in white linens. He provides life-saving grain to the nations. What does Jesus say? I am the bread of life. How much does it cost? This is the good news. What does Joseph do? Even though he saves their life, he's noble. I'm not knocking Joseph. He's amazingly righteous and suffering and everything else. His one folly is he's a big government guy. And look what happened. What does he do? He says, pay me and I'll give you grain. What does Jesus say? I'll pay it. I got it. Here's bread of life, free. It's free. He clothes his brothers with the finest of linens and he prepares a place for his family. The whole story is pointing you, saying, like, so when God ordains this story, this is the fun part of it. It's like, yeah, this is academically and intellectually, it's like, oh, wow, they really match and they line up. But then you see, okay, in the archaeology, like if I'm a skeptic, this stuff really happened. It seems to jive, like this story has some basis in reality. But that also means that when God ordained this story 3,800 years ago, what's he singing about as he ordains this history into motion as the author of all things? He's really excited about what he's going to do with you. And this is just like the prelude to the master show of what Jesus is going to do as he comes and shows that he's a far greater Joseph. And he's coming to prepare a far better place with a far better bread and far better linens and far better everything for you. And he's coming with his robe dipped in blood because he too was betrayed by his brothers. Just awesome. Love that. And so, let's skip through this. What time do we have? Does anybody have any questions on that before we get to the next confusing topic? All right, so this is a guy, the actual evidence concerning the Exodus resembles the evidence for the unicorn. We're not going to get all the way to hang on to that quote. You'll have to come back in 2 weeks to find out why that's absurd now. All right. So when you get into the scriptures, now we're in Exodus. Joseph goes down, betrayed by his brothers. They come down to buy grain. He sees them. He forgives them. He welcomes them in. He gives them the best parts of the land of Egypt with Pharaoh's permission. They stay there. Why? Does anybody ever think like they could have gone back home? When the famine was over and everything's good again, why didn't they go back? Because Egypt's kind of nice. Can you relate to that? How many times as a believer have you been like, I just want to go back? Am I allowed to say that? But it's like, man, this dying to self business. I wished I could just give my passions to whatever. That's Egypt. It's death. It's when they're coming out in the Exodus, it's, oh, I wish we were back in Egypt where we had pots of meat, but now we're out here with the stupid manna, and they're grumbling like we grumble. But they didn't go back. So they come into Egypt, and it says the descendants of Jacob numbered 70 in all when they come. Joseph's already in Egypt. So now it's crazy. So we start with 70. How many do we end with? In Exodus 12, 430 years later, the Israelites journeyed from Ramses to Succoth. There were about 600,000 men on foot, besides women and children. And so everybody always comes to this. Again, the skeptic. Like naturally me going, hold on a minute. 600,000 men assumes 600,000 women, maybe more because they were killing baby boys. Then all the children on top of that. That's where people come up with the 2 million people number, if you've ever heard that. How do you get there from 70 in the course of 430 years? Does that work? And when you do the math of what birth rates were like in the ancient world, it's not a big jump. So I'll give you a comparison. In the colonial times in America, how many kids did the average woman have? Anybody know? It's 8. Very good. I think Benjamin Franklin came from a family of 15. They had huge families. So this is just assuming that they had 4 kids, okay? Not 8, 4, to where it would double every generation. And you just watch it double, and you go 400 years, and you land there. So if it's any higher, if the fertility rate is any greater than that, greater than 4, which we have African nations today where the highest fertility rate is, that's way beyond 4 today. So if that sustained for 400 years, you would come about pretty much right at that number, right where you would expect. And so now Joseph and all his brothers and all that generation died, but the Israelites were fruitful and multiplied. Genesis 1, right? They were fruitful and multiplied greatly and became exceedingly numerous, so that the land was filled with them. But a new king came that did not know about Joseph. He came to power in Egypt. Look, he said to his people, the Israelites have become much too numerous for us. Now here's an error that you got to be careful with. Are they enslaved for 400 years? 430. So they're there 430 years. Are they enslaved the whole time? Kind of. So when they get there, they're placed in charge of Pharaoh's livestock. So technically, it's like you're enslaved in my mansion with the finest of servants and eating the best of the land, right? But they're under Pharaoh's service with the best. So is the slavery rough? Not rough enough for them to leave, but it's posh slavery, right? This goes on for a long time. Then you get a new king who doesn't come to power. This king that starts being harsh toward them doesn't come to power until he can say this: the Israelites have become much too numerous for us. So is it 70? Is it 140? Is it 280? No way. It's later. So they have kind of posh slavery, I argue, because their brutal slavery doesn't begin right away. They haven't become numerous yet. Couldn't have been. And so they stay there, frog in the boiling pot. Their slavery's increasing slowly, slowly, slowly. And then we get a new Pharaoh, and he's like, bam, I got you. And now it gets really intense. So it's a frog in a pot kind of a thing. It's not like Joseph died and it's like, ha, I got you. Now severe slavery. So anyway, they will become too numerous, and if a war breaks out, will join our enemies and fight against us and leave the country. So they put slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labor, and they built Pithom and Ramses as store cities for Pharaoh. What are they not building? They're not building pyramids. Every childhood cartoon I ever saw, I never watched these when I was a kid. I didn't become a Christian until later. But the cartoons is where I got my theological education. They're always building statues of Pharaoh and pyramids. No, they're not. That's not at all what it says. They're building storage cities, right? There is a powerful lesson that's woven into the Bible that's an object lesson that's practical for us, right? Why did Joseph's brothers go to Egypt in the first place? They're in search of grain, right? They don't trust God to provide for them. So here's something, I'm going to close with this before we get any further, because I don't think we'll get a chance to get into this, and it's really cool, so I don't want to half it. If you go back to Abraham, guess what he faces? He faces an intense famine in Genesis chapter 12. What does he do? He goes down to Egypt. What happens? Pharaoh takes his bride Sarah, puts her in the harem. God has to come and rescue her by pouring out plagues on Pharaoh's household, so that God will say, okay, Sarah, get out of here. And oh, by the way, here's a bunch of plunder and stuff that I'm going to give you for your troubles. Please take your God and go along, right? Sound familiar? Prelude of what's coming. So then Isaac, Genesis 26, is in Israel, enjoying himself in Gerar. And all of a sudden, a really intense plague happens. And God comes to him and says, Isaac, don't be like your dad. I've called you to this place. This is the place I'm going to bless you. I know the circumstances don't make sense right now, and there's famine all around you. Hang on to the promise. Stay put. And he says, do not go down to Egypt. And Isaac stays. And he's blessed with crops 100-fold, becomes one of the wealthiest men. All the people of Gerar are like, how in the world? Like, they recognize the blessing. And Isaac becomes fabulously wealthy. His son Jacob is in the land and is hit with a famine. Every one of the patriarchs hit with a famine. What does Jacob do? They're in the famine. He hears there's grain down in Egypt. He knows his granddad's story. He knows his dad's story. Which one should he choose? Hey, Isaac was blessed when he trusted and stayed. He looks at his kids and says, what are you looking at each other for? Go down to Egypt and get grain. And what happens? Every time you go to Egypt to search for grain, you get enslaved, right? Something bad happens. Some calamity befalls you when you don't trust God where he's called you. And so they get enslaved for 400 years. And what are they doing? They're building storage cities. For what? Grain. That is the human story. Hang on. Can you trust God for your grain tomorrow? Yeah. But what do we always want to do? Well, maybe a little bit more. I need 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 a little bit more. And before you know it, what happens to you? You get enslaved storing up. In the Sermon on the Mount, what does Jesus say? Give us this day our daily bread. And then what does he say? Do not store up for yourselves treasures, that rust destroys and the moths eat. Don't store up. Trust for your daily bread. That's the story here. When they're delivered out of Egypt, God's not done with the sermon. You've been storing up for 400 years. You don't trust me? I'm not leading you to the promised land because you're too cowardly and you won't listen to me. So you're going to stay out in a wilderness that's in perpetual famine. And what do you have to trust me for? Daily bread. 1 day's manna. 1 day's manna. 1 day's manna. I'm gonna walk you through a detox program of not trusting me. 1 day at a time. 1 day at a time. Stop trying to store up and get everything figured out. I'm your God. I've got you. If you try storing up, you're going to be enslaved. Trust me, I'll take care of you where I've called you. And so that is the greater story behind them sitting in for 400 years, slaving away to store up. Like, I hate storing, and I'm so prone to it. Like, more, I need security, and before you know it, I've totally forgotten all of my priorities, and I'm just slaving away, piling up my acorns. And that's God walking a 700-year or 600-year object lesson for the Israelites that we can learn from. Yeah, hopefully. 1 minute.
Brings to my mind the dock strike.
Yeah.
We naturally do. There'll be shortages because store up.
100%. And part of that is wisdom. So it's like in the Proverbs it says, the wise ant or whatever stores up. So you don't want to be caught endangering your family, but if you make an idol out of it and your trust is in your horses and chariots, that's not good, Any other questions? Next time we get into how when the Bible describes what's going on in Egypt, what's going on with the Pharaoh, what goes on with Moses' birth, weird things like why in the world is the Pharaoh's daughter able to find Moses floating down the Nile in a basket? Why would Pharaoh's daughter be in a slave city? Why would Pharaoh be in the slave city when the plagues come? Pharaohs didn't stay in slave cities. How do you make sense of that? Because everybody always used to say, the Bible, that didn't happen. Their capitals were Thebes and Memphis. Pharaoh wouldn't be there for Moses to talk to in a slave city. Come back next time because, oh yes, he would. Let me pray for us. Father God, Lord, you are so good. And I love the fact that as we walk through these scriptures, we talk about Abraham and how he's called to sacrifice his son, and even in that story, in all the ways that it points to you. The father who gives up his only beloved son, puts him on a donkey, takes him to Jerusalem, puts the wood on his shoulders, climbs the mountain. Lord, it's all screaming your mission, but you won't let him do it. You did it. And we see Joseph, who's the beloved son of his father, who's highly praised and betrayed for silver and sold down to the land of death and undergoes all sorts of false accusations and injustices, and yet forgives his brothers and pledges to give his brothers the bread of life and to give them the best part of the land. And he falls short, but you don't. And I love how we can go through the scriptures and see all of these stories and the ways that you've ordained them and authored them into being that just scream that, Lord, you're obsessed with our redemption, even through ancient times. And if you're that obsessed that you would wield the story of history to sing about what your son is going to do for his people, we must be pretty special to you. You are a good God. Lord, I pray that as we leave here this day, not just the archaeological stuff that's cool and mentally stimulating maybe, hopefully, but Lord, that we would see that you are the faithful God who steps in, and you're far greater than our greatest heroes, and you love us at greater expense than anyone we know. So we thank you for being our God. We ask you to help us to love you more and to be the people who can trust you for daily bread and not slave away. We pray this in Christ's name. Amen. All right. See you in a couple weeks.